This is Brave New History. I'm here with Ike Baker of Arcanum podcast. And that's instead of a U, it's a V if you want to check them out. But yeah, we're talking today about Platonism, Freemasonry, Kabbalah. I know you're working on a book about Kabbalah. And yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the subjects. It's a broad survey of the Western esoteric traditions, um, coming out through Tria Prima this year. It's unless somebody twists my arm, the title is A Formless Fire. So pulling that from the Chaldean oracles in reference.
All right.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's great to be back here and talking with you. And you're a man that loves Freemasonry, Platonism, like myself. And I'm excited to discuss some stuff with you today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. And yeah, maybe we'll start with the idea of daimon. We were
Mm.
talking about that before, and what happiness, as Plato described it. And yeah, if you want to start with your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think what we were talking about in connection with that was this idea that according to some of the Prestonian stuff for any of the Masons listening, we talked about the differentiation between operative and speculative masonry, and speculative masonry leading towards happiness, and we're like, is that really it? And then understanding Preston's, basically the period that he went through in order to call these, put together these beautiful degree lectures, which are really part and parcel of the degree. They're virtually inseparable at this point. And a lot of that was Platonism. A lot of that was Kabbalah. A lot of that was Hermeticism. And Elliot, you brought up the point that, like, yeah, well, that's what Plato says about philosophy, the point of life, and that sort of thing. But my challenge to that is this idea of translation. And as somebody that speaks Greek, I kind of understand. Don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect. I wasn't born there, but it was spoken a lot in my home, and we've got a lot of different words that express different nuances of a thing. And eudaimonia or evdaimonia, if you could kind of translate it literally, it means, if anything, probably like true diamond. And for this transcends happiness in all sorts of different directions. But it gets translated that way by Anglophones, and I'm not crapping on anybody, right? I've not gone to the trouble to translate Plato, but there, I mean, anybody that has looked at any of this stuff, I think that they would, to some degree or another, agree that we need an update. We need we need something a little broader, more nuanced, and holistic in terms of looking at these words and what they mean, because it can significantly alter the message. But to me, the way that I wrap my head around that was, first you got to know a couple of things about the daimon. And what we had laid out was this idea, right, of the hierarchical chains of they get really expounded later. They're brought up in Porphyry, they're brought up in Iamblichus, but really in the way that we receive them in Western esoteric traditions in the modern day is typically by Agrippa, who uses. So what he was basing his stuff on was Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a student of Proclus. And that's very interesting, because Proclus is the one who develops this idea of the henad, right? Working from Platinian cosmology and that emanative cosmology, and really being at the amazing very advantageous point in history where he had all these wonderful philosophers and scholarks and wonderful minds to look back at, and then synthesize all their thought, right? Because he was an initiate of the Platonic school. I believe it was a scholar, but great translator for anybody that's interested in any of this stuff. Proclus is probably my #1 recommendation after Plato. But he talks about the henads, and the henads as these individuated units that sort of were the heads of these ontological chains, these hierarchies. And you have a similar idea in Kabbalah. If you think about the Sephirot, you know, you have Geburah, the Sephirah of severity, or Din Pachad, you know, justice. Then you have Hesed, the Sephirah of mercy. So those are kind of like henads, you know, this is the henad of this thing. It's first purest individuation of that particular concept. Well, everything in the universe, everything in the material universe has that. And you do too. People have those things. It's part of what we consider now, we call in more modern esoteric orders and communities, part of your spiritual architecture. And so that henad really, at least the way it's worked in systems like the Golden Dawn, is conceptualized as the ideal self. And I believe that Plato's sort of mythic narrative symbol for that was the daimon. You know, for me, true daimon in that sense, and you know, well-being, having to do with embodying that archetype and living up to your ideal, right? Plato was one of, you know, he was the guy that talked about the ideals, the realm of forms and things like that, and introduced us, at least the modern Western world, it introduced us to these kinds of abstract ontological concepts. And so I think that is probably closer to what philosophy was supposed to accomplish, the embodiment of the personal, the henad of the self, the archetype, you know, as we would call it, the ideal of the self. So that's, and to be honest with you, I mean, I think if you really follow the tenets of just Blue Lodge Freemasonry, I think that's trying to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Especially with, is it Iamblichus that, well, I think it's all of theurgy, where the first step is to subdue your passions, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we have that in the first degree, the Entered Apprentice, that the first thing you do is subdue your passions, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, who was it? One of the Neoplatonists said that it's like going inward and upward, right? So you go into the soul and then you ascend upwards towards deity. And part of me wonders when I heard that, he doesn't say it in those exact words, inward and upwards, but that's the gist of it. Mm-hmm. Part of me wonders if that's, you know, we look at the staircase, right, as theurgical, where I'm kind of convinced we're talking theurgy, and inward and upward, right? That's just kind of like the spiral staircase. Maybe I'm reading a bit into it, but
no, I like that. I like that. I think it also, we were also talking about this kind of idea of a Kabbalistic model and how it was, you know, the Hebrew Kabbalah, or I would say the Hermetic Kabbalah, which is how most modern Western occultists receive the Kabbalah. We're not practicing kosher Kabbalah. You know, it's not Kabbalah with a capital K. You know, you want to talk about putting the tarot cards on the Navitat, you know, it's like, you know, people invested in rabbinical Judaism are going to look at us like, what are you talking about? You know, but the way it's given to us, hermetically, I would say, in the magical context or initiatic context, is it's a wonderful way of working the system for a couple of reasons. But it's not, I don't think that that is purely Judaic. I mean, nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything is due to cross-pollination. But truly, the more we find out about the Hellenized Judaism, the more comes to mainstream consciousness about the cultural milieu within which Hermetism and Neoplatonism flourished in, first centuries Alexandria. We're learning more that really these things are all intertwined very, very deeply. But the interesting thing for me is that, if you're in Malkuth, the lowermost, let me see if I can get a picture of my tree of life here, just in case. If you're here, right, in Malkuth, that's supposed to be the representation. You're the bottom of the tree. That's supposed to be this representation of the physical world. This right here, that trajectory, that little path that leads from the sublunary to the lunary world. So that's we call that the path of the underworld, right? So in order to move up the tree and beyond the causal spheres and move through the spheres of the heavens, you first have to go into the underworld. And that is very much allied with the Merkaba mysticism, because those Hellenistic Jews of that time period, those mystics, they, the whole thing about Merkaba was to go outward. It was the same thing. It's predicated on the Ogdoad and the Ennead, and transcending the spheres of causality. But they didn't go up. They went down first. And to your point, going inward to go upward. The tree of life is actually the best model, but it's not exclusively Hebrew, because when you look at it, of the newest work on this subject, P.D. Newman released an amazing book, which I'm sure everybody knows, Theurgy, Theory, and Practice. And he points out the relevance of the pre-Socratic katabatic iterations of the mysteries, the Orphic stuff, even Pythagoras. The idea that there was a tradition of shamanism that involved the person going inward or traveling into the underworld first in order to ascend. And I think that the way to conceptualize that, rather not entirely literally, is the way that you're pointing out here is, well, you have to go inward first. You have to kind of deprive the senses and go inward first. And I do think, again, that is a big part of Freemasonry, particularly, I would say, the second degree of Freemasonry.
Yeah. Yeah. Why the second degree in particular? Is that because of the middle chamber?
Yeah. For me,
Yeah.
I mean, really what happens in the third degree is that's, again, using the Kabbalistic model, which we know, right? John Byram and John Theophilus de Saguier involved in Byram's Kabbalah Club, and Chris Powell did that great Ars Quattro Coronati article talking about his introduction of the Hiramic legend. He was a big player in all of this at these formative stages, and even Preston baking Kabbalah into this stuff. Well, on the tree of life, there are successive. So you have this kind of upward ascent here, but then you've got these what are called the reciprocal paths that act as kind of they run horizontally and they act as veils. Okay, so there's 3 of those, and at each one, it's kind of like that voyage of Inanna, that she has to completely disrobe and get naked and divest herself of everything in her ascent to through the underworld. And I think that is really the the structure of Freemasonry, as well as their subsequent kind of terminal events, to put it that way. But I think the second degree is a really good example by way of, to your point, the staircase. Because so as you're talking, the first sort of protocol in the theurgic curriculum, this was actually called the Ladder of Virtues, and there were 12 different Platonic dialogues that were to go with each one of them and sort of teach them.
So what's that? The ladder of virtue was ritual in Masonry?
Well, no. But here's what I'm trying to say about it. That's a theurgic thing in Platonism. That actually Porphyry had it, but Iamblichus perfected it. He added the seventh and final virtue. But essentially, what you're talking about, right, is divesting yourself being the first step. Well, there was the natural virtue was the first rung of that ladder, and that was physicality, care for the self and the body, right? And that was kind of taken for granted, right? Plato was a wrestler, and not just that. People don't realize, like, the Academia did not resemble a modern academy. There was built-in time for these men to wrestle each other before they got to talking. There was exercise, gymnastics included, built into that time period in the academy. And so that didn't really get a whole lot of coverage because it was just kind of taken for granted. People took care of themselves. That was, but it related to things like physical temperance and things like that. And then the next one was the ethical virtues, which is, learning to control yourself, divest yourself of, all of it. I would say the first subsection of the first three virtues could be conceptualized as the first degree of Masonry, the EA. And I've made that point before. And then you go to the civic virtues. So you have natural, ethical, and civic. That's the first group. And the civic virtues are, sort of being a boon and extending that temperance throughout the broader community, being a benefit to the community, things like that. And that is very much Masonic. And then you graduated to philosophical contemplation, things like that. The contemplative virtues, where you would be literally sort of pulling away from purely mundane concerns and utilizing the mind and getting into the realm of mentation, and we would call it meditating, but they kind of contemplating the Platonic solids and things like that, and cathartic or purificatory virtues, where you're finally pulling away from over concern with the purely material circumstances of your life. And then the next, and it's a little more tenuous, completing the second grouping of three of those rungs, would be the paradigmatic. And that is essentially when you begin to embody the demiurge and right, ton agathon, the good, and I guess you could call it nous. And you are now able to, you become a magician at that point. You are able to co-create as a miniature demiurge, utilizing the forms, utilizing those paradigms. And then Iamblichus perfected it. He added theurgy to the top of it. But one of the things that Iamblichus, and I'm pretty sure it was Iamblichus, but if not Proclus, they said that in order to ascend this rung, this ladder of the virtues and become a theurgist properly, because the seventh was a totally different thing. So you have a system of three right there: the bottom three, the second three, and then you're a theurgist. You're reborn at that point, completely independent of fate. And what I mean by fate is astrological fate, zodiacal fate, and you kind of transcend that. And But you see, Proclus, I believe, makes mention that, like, in order to do this, you have to learn all of the world's knowledge, all of it, in order to be a true philosopher, and then transcend it. And I mean, what is that if not the spiral staircase? Because
Yeah.
it's at that point that you arrive at the middle chamber, for further instruction. And to me, that middle chamber has always been Tifereth, the mediating sphere on the tree of life, and that is the only place in well, I would say the tradition of, let's say, something like the Golden Dawn. That is the medial point, that central chamber on the tree of life. That is where you embody your archetype. That is where you become the vessel of your daimon, your henad, and it changes everything for you, because who you thought you were is gone. It's dead, and it can never come back, because you're allowing the higher part of your spiritual architecture to dictate your life.
Yeah. And, I wonder with, well, there's a lot to that, where my first thought is we have the three sets of three. I wonder if that, I mean, maybe I'm just kind of pulling parallels together where they don't exist, but the cryptic degrees, right? Maybe we have illusion there where there's the crypts, right? I think there's nine of them total. I wonder if there might be similarity there. And then with the middle chamber, we have like the alchemical counterpart would be the great work, right? And there's like, after you've ascended, this whatever it is, that there's something especially cool at the top, right? What you've been looking for. So here in Masonry, there's the G, right, which can allude to geometry and God.
Mhm.
I wonder if that's not intentional. That, well, obviously it is, but that just like Socrates, they said he was supposed to like conceptualize God as geometry itself, right? Which people have speculated that's why he was put to death, was sentenced to death.
Right.
Is that they said he was both an atheist and preaching foreign gods, which is interesting. That, well, you can't have it. You can't have both. You can't be guilty of both, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's
but
interesting, because
mhm.
I'm pretty sure that a very famous quote from Plato is that God geometrizes continually.
Like, meaning like geometrize, meaning
Well, he would have been talking about the divine nous, and so the nous takes the forms that are latent and diffuse within the absolute, and sort of individuates them for contemplation. And what does that turn into? Well, it turns into the substructure of reality, which is geometry. So God is constantly permutating on its own principles. It's constantly manifesting things from them. God plays with building blocks. He likes an erector set. That's really what it means. Is the good to agathon is constantly creating, but he doesn't create garbage. It's things here have beauty, they have order, and they have form, and that form, as the Greeks would have conceptualized it. And even if just anybody, if you start studying geometry properly, you start realizing, like, oh, this entire thing, I'm not sure what reality is, but if it's anything, it's geometry.
yeah. And it's interesting how, we were talking about Timaeus. I don't think we were on air at the time, but it's interesting how we have the craftsman, right, the demiurge, and we're through Masonry imitating that as craftsmen, right? And we have the universe created by being emanated out, and then it gets into ascending again, right? So we have it going out, and then reaching deity or the good is the opposite, right? And so we're kind of doing the same things. And I might have said this last time we were talking, but it's interesting how we have the 5 Platonic solids, and we have the 5 elements, if you include ether, which uh, would get us up. Well, I think Plato says as much, that there's also a 5th, but he doesn't name it. Well, when we have earth, fire, water, air, right, and then ether. So there's 5 of those, right? And I wonder, I'm pretty sure that when we talk about the 5 orders of architecture, that's analogous to the 5 Platonic solids, right? That we're constructing those. And just as in Timaeus, he talks about how those were constructed, right? And it's interesting how we have the parallels with Rosicrucianism, which I think they get a little bit into the building of King Solomon's temple. I'm not a Rosicrucian, I don't know, but and alchemy, the same or similar metaphors.
Well, yeah,
But
the Rosicrucians talk about being there are allusions to craftsmanship in they built their headquarters called the Domus Spiritus Sanctum, the house of the Holy Spirit. And not only that, but Christian Rosenkreuz or Frater CR, Frater CR, he constructs his own tomb, which is meant to be a miniature universe.
yeah, then there's I don't know too much about Rosicrucianism, but they have the same idea of the name of deity inscribed on a triangular plate. And then I know they're famous, like the earliest things we know about Rosicrucianism is the alchemical wedding, right? I'm not super familiar with it.
Yeah,
But
we've got there's a trilogy of manifestos, and the earliest is actually called the Fama Fraternitatis, and then the second one is the Confessio, and the third one is the Alchemical Wedding. Gemische Hochzeit Christiani Rosenkreuz in German. But it's a completely different tone. It's a completely different writing. That's actually the only one that's with confirmed authorship. A lot of people mix that up. They say that one dude, Johann Valentin Andre, penned all 3 of them. He only admitted to penning the third one. We know that he was involved with a group called the Tübingen Circle that essentially wrote or designated to be written those first 2 Rosicrucian pamphlets. But that's where we get a lot of that stuff from, and it's it's exemplary of what was going on, believe it or not. So you had all these people back then that we just had a surge, a rediscovery of the Hermetic texts. The Corpus Hermeticum being retranslated by Ficino. I mean, a lot of people don't even pay attention, but Ludovico Lazzarelli is really the first Hermetist Christian. To go on record and say, I am a student of Hermes and I'm a Christian. And so that starts happening a lot of times. There's people trying to rectify this new intellectual culture, these avenues of exploring the path while holding on to their Christianity. And that was a very new thing for that period. And it's an incredible thing to see what those people did with that at the time. But another consequence, particularly right in Germany and those northern Switzerland and places like this is where all the Rosicrucian stuff was happening. Paracelsus was a major influence on the Rosicrucians. I would say preeminent influence on all forms of Rosicrucianism. And who was his teacher, right? Trithemius, of the abbot of Sponheim, his student was Cornelius Agrippas. It's a very German thing happening here, and there was Protestantism that really affected their perceptual lens on how all that stuff got mixed together. So there was again this idea that they were going to reform humanity, and it was based on these very Protestant humanist lines. And so that's kind of where Rosicrucianism diverges to a degree from all forms of magic and that sort of stuff, philosophy that came before it. But it wasn't uncommon, like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. They attempted a Hermetic reformation of the Catholic Church. They failed. But and then really, I mean, Freemasonry kind of, for me, at least the modern, the early modern period of Freemasonry was heavily influenced by that Rosicrucianism. Those it's strange because there's a strong religious undercurrent, but it's still loaded with Enlightenment era ideals, which ultimately atheistic Enlightenment philosophy leads us to postmodernism. So there's all sorts of really interesting dichotomies there. But I think the most interesting thing that dawned on me from what you said was the idea of the 5 orders of architecture corresponding to the 5 Platonic solids, because those pillars were essentially they were the forms with which human beings created things, created structures, temples, things like that. Temples were always meant to be a miniature microcosm. The same way the vault of Christian Rosenkreuz was supposed to be a miniature copy of the universe. And so that has a direct parallel to the idea that, Plato kind of says, like, these 5 forms are the forms that the demiurge uses to create the universe. So that is a really, really compelling and interesting thought right there.
Yeah. Have you thought about that before, or the idea that the Platonic solids? Because I was reading Timaeus.
You mentioned it last time
Okay.
we were on the podcast, and I've since then I've chewed on it, but I didn't get that far. Like tonight, I got it. Just light went off. So.
Got it. Yeah, and I mean it's really interesting about how much of it I think is based off of, at least for me, that I was reading William Preston and his works, right? And they have the second degree ritual in it, right? And in that version of it, they're talking about how Masonry comes from Egypt, right? Just like in Timaeus, maybe that's where this whole Egyptology thing comes from, about the ancient mysteries coming out of Egypt, right? Where they say that because of the Nile, it's like always a little bit damp, so the fires that consume the earth don't hit Egypt, and they also don't flood, right? And then but anyway, that's mentioned in the second degree with the William Preston version, where I've not seen that before, right? And in Timaeus, they're saying that the secrets or the histories are stored in the temples, right? Just like, and they talk about to survive fire and flood, conflagration and inundation, right? And so I'm thinking that's where the idea of Jacob and Boaz being hollow comes from, just to preserve knowledge, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole myth concerned with the pillars of Hermes from that Hellenistic period. Actually, I think just before the Great Deluge, Hermes Trismegistus. There's 2 versions. Either the first one is that he writes all of the knowledge and wisdom known to humankind that is possible in the universe. He has it inscribed on the pillars. 2 pillars, massive pillars. And another version is the pillars are hollow, and you pop the top open, and he sticks everything in scrolls and things like that inside. And the deluge comes, and the myth goes that one is unearthed by Heliopolis and the other one is unearthed outside of Thebes. So I mean that's and it's what's really interesting, especially if you're into the Golden Dawn. like I am. When they're discovered, actually, historically, actually, these are so Dennis William Hawke, actually, the alchemist and author. So I don't know where he's getting it from because I didn't look into his citations, but he says that it's actually in like extant priestly documents. It says that they found both of those pillars, and that when they were discovered, and this actually I had heard elsewhere, they were called the pillars of the gods of the dawning light, which is super, super interesting to me, right? Because I mean, that's what Masonry is about. You always trying to get to the East, and then finally the East coming to you with the light, you know?
Yeah, I think Josephus mentioned something like that, the Pillars of Enoch, that they still exist in his time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think I haven't read it, but I think in Plato's Laws that there's a mention of there's 10 pillars, and on the pillars are inscribed the laws, and they consult it. I might be off, but I wonder if that's kind of where the idea of that comes from, inscribing on pillars.
Yeah. Um, it's definitely something that has, you know, it's a key feature of the rituals of the Western esoteric tradition because it comes down to us from Masonry principally, but then it kind of gets disseminated throughout the broader, I guess, fringe occult community through the Golden Dawn. I mean, it's essential. I mean, the thing is, the pillars in a Masonic hall, they're not really pointed out until the second degree. Whereas in the Golden Dawn, the pillars are the fixture of the rituals, all of them. So they play a much more prominent part, and they are inscribed with they have to be inscribed with hieroglyphics from the 120th and 17th chapters of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is really interesting to me. I mean, if you even, we talk about all this stuff. I mean, I think it's in the might be the Phaedo, where Plato actually he talks about the god Thoth, and he says Thoth made, he created numbers, letters, and most importantly words, or most importantly letters, however it gets phrased. And then you have an attestation that he trained with the Horite priest Sechnufis for a number of years, to Plato himself. And Pythagoras obviously is attested by Iamblichus to have studied for, I think, 22 years in Egypt, astronomizing and geometrizing. That's the actual words that he puts it. So yeah, I mean, because the thing is, even at that time, ancient Egypt was an ancient civilization. So at that time, like the Egyptians at that point were as old to the ancient Greeks as the ancient Greeks are to us now. So it's always been this, beacon, except back then they could travel there by boat or by caravan. It's part of the whole Mediterranean greater community there. And they still had, an apex civilization in the, actually working physically. You could go there and see the pyramids and go, go into the temples and study and learn and see that just incredible stuff while it was happening.
Yeah, that's an interesting point where you could it's as old as ancient Greek is to us now. So I mean, it was ancient even in ancient times.
Yeah,
so that's kind of, I guess, why Plato would have to point that out, where Egypt, the civilization just doesn't lose its history.
Right.
But let's see. Looks like we have a bunch of comments here in the chat.
We do.
But they're all from Karl Karsnak here. But maybe we can get to that maybe in a bit.
Sure.
But one thing I wanted to touch on, we kind of touched on it briefly, is the that article in Ars. How do you pronounce it? Quietar Coronati.
Quattuor Coronati. Yeah.
Okay, one of these days I'll get it. But
Yeah,
with
I think it means
Hiramic,
four crowns, right?
yeah, maybe I'll just say that. What is it? Ars means art
Art.
of.
Yeah.
Yeah, the art of the four crowns. But I guess it sounds better in Latin. But
Everything
with
does.
the well, yeah, there you go. You just sound smarter.
Yeah.
But with the idea of John Theophilus de Goulier, I'm probably mispronouncing that also, but which I'm convinced he makes a very good point that this is the guy who came up with Hiramic legend. So however it was made begins with this guy, and then they're talking about the four sons of Aemon. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not sure, but yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think maybe he has something there?
Well, I think your point kind of earlier was like there's no direct, explicit type of reference there, and I think that we are not likely to find one. Um, but I do see Desaguliers being somebody influential enough. He also, eh, um, he was one of the grand masters too, in the early Grand Lodge period. So he would have, there was a lot of innovation happening there and a lot of kind of, feeling their way in that early modern period. And I definitely see him as somebody associating with, yeah, I mean, it's attested that he was a member of John Byram's Kabbalah club and things of that nature. So I definitely see him as an esotericist. I definitely see him in the position to contribute. But I don't know what the real
Yeah.
origins are. I think if anything, and I know it's not the first time that this has ever been uh, correlated, but I think he did a great job of it. Nate Schick in his book, The Grand Communication, that came out just like a couple months ago. He talks about this. He alludes to the connection between, when you study languages, really the main difference in pronunciation is in the vowels, right? So and a lot of those ancient languages didn't have an entire complement of vowels. They were just a series of consonants. That's still the way you read Hebrew, and this really interesting idea of HRM, Hiram and Hermes. That to me kind of is our best kind of guess. Also, I've been studying a lot more for the book. The chapter before I tackled
Mhm.
Kabbalah was the grimoire traditions, heavily Solomonic, and I'm not going to do a great job recounting it now, so I won't. But there are in some of the Solomonic legends, let's say, that come from the Midrash, which are like commentaries on the Torah and scripture. It's some of them are part of the Talmud, and some of them are just kind of independent uh, commentaries. But a lot of the Solomonic legends that end up completely being the foundation of the modern, and medieval Renaissance period grimoire traditions come from that literature, and some of it. I mean, if you were to really sit there and piece it out, I mean, you've got bits and pieces of the Hiramic legend in the midrash commentaries of the
Yeah.
Solomonic legend, which you've got to go in and kind of take a look at that stuff, and then you go look at like those grimoires, like the Testament of Solomon, the Greater and Lesser Keys, and see what they have to say within their own personal mythologies. But there are makings of the Hiramic legend just in that stuff alone, in those that kind of scriptural exegesis But I think what's more important is that we, Masons understand what the Hiramic legend is trying to, inculcate and tell us. We have to understand it, right? I say that all the time. It's pedantic, so people want to smack me in the face. But Masonry is, a system of morality, a beautiful system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. So it's like, if you're not trying to understand the symbols, then you're not doing speculative Masonry. You're not doing it. It's like, it doesn't matter to get there together and, do business, read the minutes, and, eat, do whatever. That's fine. It's fun. That's a big part of the fraternity, but that's not what it was meant for, right? There's a very clear telos behind Masonry that its early modern organizers just shove in our face. And so, if we want to ignore that because we have these hang-ups and we've got these sleeping dogs that we want to let lie on whether or not Masonry fits into my neat little mental package of what is allowable by my standard of religion or tradition, etc. That's one thing. But I'm going to steal a word that you used. It's virtually indisputable that Masonry is filled to the brim with this kind of symbolism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's about the symbols, right? And what we're kind of conveying by the story, right? And a few of my thoughts is that the Hiramic legend doesn't really, there's something strange archetypally with it, where it's bizarre that you're betrayed by your student. Like that, you really don't see that. And it's almost like the master and apprentice motif, right? Where the apprentice does something wild, but in this case, um, it's killing the master, which doesn't seem archetypally true. That there's something going on there to me. Where what is that saying, right? And and then to your other point, where it's about the symbols, it's not where what the symbols are actually derived from necessarily, right? It's about the message itself, where kind of like we were talking about, true daimon, where let's say someone's coming to Masonry and they're reading something in Greek and that's what inspires them, but they understand it as happiness, right? So it doesn't really matter, at least in this context, what the ancient Greek meant. To them, it meant that, and then that's what these symbols mean, right? So, yeah, I mean, when we're constructing the Hiramic legend on what's going on, it would be helpful to have like, why was this the way that this was?
Yeah.
I mean, at least we're pretty sure we know who did it. So kind of tracing out the symbols kind of becomes easier. We can kind of understand his mind a bit.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the main things, there are 2 points I want to make here in connection with that, because it's kind of coming back to me. There's in the Midrash literature that I was talking about before. I think it's I don't remember which Midrash it's from, but so one of the things that we kind of tiptoe around a little bit is that Solomon, in one of these Midrash interpretations, is that Solomon built his temple. His workmen were the demons that he bound and kept in this little box, and he did it by way of this magical ring that was given to him by the archangel Michael, and it had God's seal on it, right, which in the form of a pentagram. It's what we call the seal of Solomon, and that's also that's the blazing star, in a lot of iterations. Some people say it's a hexagram, also the seal of Solomon. Some people say it's a pentagram, and The earliest versions I've seen have rendered it as a pentagram. And so the tradition is that he had this ring that he wore, and we given to him by the Archangel Michael, and he became a demon hunter essentially. But he used their labor to build his temple. Well, one of the Midrash interpretations says that a demon named, I think, Hashmodai asked him, like sort of cornered him and asked him for the ring. Like, I want the power to do. I want the master's power. And when he was denied, he, well, I think he threw him out of the temple or something like that. But it's kind of implied that Solomon died. Like, you don't know if he ever comes back. It's kind of this unresolved thing about who's ruling Israel. So that's a really interesting point. But another important thing is that I do see, right, the three pillars, wisdom, strength, and beauty. So there's something really important there, because those correspond to Sephirot on three distinct Sephirot on the three distinct pillars of the tree of life. And right, so wisdom obviously being in Chokmah. Here you've got, it's right here, this whole pillar right here. The head of that, that's the top of that is wisdom. And you have strength. That's down here. That's Geburah, the middle Sephirah on the pillar of severity. So you have the pillar of mercy, the pillar of severity. Then you have beauty right here, Tifereth, right? These are what the words mean. So it's really interesting that there's this triangulating shape. And if you orient the hall to agree with, where these pillars are, beauty is right. As the sun at meridian is the beauty and glory of the day, that's the junior warden in the south. And so you have master of the lodge, senior and junior warden, and then you've got, that's where, at least in the North Carolina jurisdiction, that is the seat of Hiram Abiff. Hiram Abiff wears the jewel of the junior Grand Warden. And so he's centered there in the middle. Now there's darkness in the north. And we understand that is because in the northern hemisphere, the sun is in the southern sky. But also, if you look at this, if you're sitting in Tifereth, you're looking directly into what is called Dot, the abyss, darkness, which is a really interesting correlation there. And I think that that kind of Kabbalistic interpretation that I just went through, I think that is really what they were trying to tell us. Because Tifereth, Kabbalistically, at least in Christian Kabbalah, right? Because these men were not studying capital K Kabbalah. They were studying the Kabbalah of Pico, Reuchlin, Kircher. They were studying Rosenroth. They were studying Christian Kabbalah with a capital C. And that is the seat of the dying and resurrecting. The death and the resurrection happens in Tifereth.
So you think, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So the dying and resurrecting, that happens on the pillar of beauty, which corresponds to the junior warden, you're saying?
Yes.
And that might, yeah, and then, well, so with, there's no resurrection, I mean, I guess until the candidate, the ceremony, well, I don't know how much we want to get into it, but
yeah.
I'm wondering how applicable dying and resurrecting is to the story.
Well, I think I personally see, so we could take a look at let's say the lecture, right? Or do you think we could get away with talking about the digits?
Digits?
Yeah, the fingers.
I mean, I don't know what you're
Well, we might have completely different degree lectures, which is not uncommon, but
Sure.
there's different grips in masonry.
Got it.
We
Got
don't we
it. Yeah.
don't we don't have to go into what they are, but
Mhm.
there's a point where the different grips are applied, and some of them fail, and then there is a final grip that succeeds. And I don't, if you feel like I'm going over the line here, edit me, take it out. But
Yeah.
but
No,
but
I've done that before in some of my videos. I'm like, oh, like,
but,
yeah.
but
But
between
yeah.
you and me, what we've got in at least the North Carolina jurisdiction is that the first grip corresponds to life and no soul, the terrestrial sort of awareness. The second grip corresponds to the soul, but no afterlife. And then the third grip corresponds to the soul and immortality. And that's the resurrection. And
Yeah.
it's attributed to a very specific animal, which
Yeah.
which is really important if you think about Christianity and Judeo-Christian applications of these ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there has to be something to that because, I mean, when I was going through Blue Lodge, I was like, this makes no sense. No one would ever do this. Like, this is not how this is done, right? Like,
Yeah.
are you stupid? Like, what are you doing? So yeah, there has to be something to that they had to like really fit that in there where it doesn't belong for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I should tell you maybe off the air, like what like when I was going through it, it's just kind of funny, but how it doesn't make any sense. But
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, the thing is that I had gone through almost everything that I'm in now before I joined Masonry. I joined Masonry was like the last thing I did. So I had already looked at these things, even there's a point in the North Carolina ritual where, there are 12 fellow craft that are told to break off into parties of 3. This is the triplicities of the zodiac, heading in their respective,
Oh,
that was the first thing I thought of, because I had all this training in the Golden Dawn and Martinism and et
yeah.
cetera, like this is the way you're supposed, that's why they use these numbers. That's why, not everything serves a purpose.
Yeah, that's interesting. It it is, isn't it?
Yeah, I love masonry, but like the thing is that they give you all these beautiful symbols and then it's like, okay, see you later. Whereas it's like in the traditions that come out of masonry, they're very, very focused. Their curriculum is based on understanding these symbols. That's like, it's not enough just to put the ritual on and maybe you understand it, because we're those men had an intellectual sort of milieu to plug into that was doing alchemy. They had Isaac Newton, Thomas Vaughan, Elias Ashmole. It was a very specific milieu of people and very specific interests in the intellectual kind of cream there. We're drowning in information. Not only that, but everybody thinks they can just channel everything. So it's like, well, this is what this means to me. That's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
that's not what this is about. It doesn't matter what it means to you. And a lot of Masons would balk at that. But the way it was put together historically, the idea that you can just interpolate is completely antithetical to the structure.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, like these metaphors, I mean, when you put them together, you can, I think, intuit where they're coming from, right? So you kind of uh, use the intellect, right? Like we're in the intelligible realm that you can kind of get at it. Like, okay, so this means this. I mean, you're not, eisegeting, really, but you're kind of. But I mean,
I think
I
that's
think a
the
lot of
best
people.
way. I think that's the best way to do it is to kind of intuit and not overthink it, because these things are, I think personally, I found them to be very, very archetypal, to borrow a modern term. I do
Mhm.
think that there is some base level where, like, yeah, you know what this is if you can just kind of tune into that.
Yeah, yeah, which kind of like I had mentioned, the whole uh, being killed by your student doesn't really seem archetypally true, right? It just doesn't like. It seems odd to me. Like it's like what are we saying really? Um, where so I would think like to get at where these symbols come from. That's a big thing.
Mhm.
Is like you'd have to see maybe some precursor story that has that element to it. And like we had been talking before, the Four Sons of Ammon, that doesn't have that element of it, right? And then
Right.
the whole like being buried and then being discovered later, and then given a better interment, that doesn't exist in the Four Sons of Ammon. But I mean, and but I mean, a lot of it does, right? You have even the masonry element, and this is a story of masons that they would tell, right? But but I don't know. He's probably like he knows more about it than I do. So maybe he's onto it, and that we just have to discover some reference to the story in masonry. But
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it's also, think about what they're using to kill the teacher. Think about where they're striking, you know. In the Golden Dawn, these ruffians are conceptualized as the threefold form of the averse personality, which is quasi demonic. The verbiage that you would use in the Golden Dawn is qliphotic, right? That's Kabbalistic. It's essentially hylic to the point of an extreme, which is what Plotinus warns about, right? Highly isn't in and of itself an evil unless the sojourning soul pursues highly for its own ends, because then it will taint the soul, and the soul will get stuck as if in some sort of tar or clay, right? That's the whole way Plotinus looks at the hylic, which would be kind of qliphotic take in Kabbalah, and it conceptualizes the ruffians as the qliphotic aspects of an individual and what they do to the soul while the soul is interred in matter. There's that whole soma sema paradox from the Gorgias. Hey, right? Socrates says, maybe we're dead and we only think we're alive. Maybe right? He says we're in the bowels of the earth, and our job is to travel upward towards the surface. The soma sema, the body is the tomb of the soul. It's the same thing with the myth of Persephone and Hades. Persephone. Why does her name mean bringer of death or murderer in Greek? Well, it's because what does she have to do in order to get abducted by Hades? Well, she's picking flowers. She's bending down. And in one of the iterations of that myth, she's picking specifically the narcissus flower. And Hades grabs her and abducts her. And because, right, she gets a pass from Zeus by way of her mom, Demeter, but she eats the pomegranate. She tastes of the fruit of the underworld, and so she has to keep coming back. I mean, what is that if it's not the story of the soul's incarnation and metempsychosis, as expounded in the Platonic dialogues? So there's that strong component of, like, your soul has to die to the spiritual, the plurimatic realms in order to become your body is the physical tomb of it. And so the whole theurgic trajectory of ascent really is symbolic of the soul coming back to life. And what has to die, right? The self.
yeah. And you think so? One other question is in the Golden Dawn, do they have their own version of the Hiramic legend?
No, um, no, they don't like do their own thing. But there are elements of Masonic ritual that persist, which you are entirely unaware of until you become an adept and you learn how to be an initiating Hierophant. And then you become aware of those things, but they are specifically couched in Coptic and Egyptian. So again, there you go. Masonry is Egyptian, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not too familiar with the Golden Dawn. Is it like they do a system of ritual, right?
Yeah, they would call it magical ritual, which means that
Mhm.
things are happening, and essentially it's broken up into an outer and an inner order. And the outer order, the whole outer order consists of 5 degree rituals and their grades where you get curriculum. They give you a binder, you get to read your ritual and learn Hebrew, you learn throughout the trajectory of the Golden Dawn, you learn several languages, Coptic, you learn the angelic language, Enochian, or at least the alphabets. Really, how far you take it is up to you. You learn alchemy, all that sort of thing. But the outer order, those 5 degrees, that's basically your EA. And then you move on to like the second degree of the Golden Dawn. And the third degree is the 5 = 6, which takes place in Tiferet on the Tree of Life. Each one of the Golden Dawn grades corresponds to one of these Sephirot. Every one of them has except for the probationary degrees, but like the ritual of Zalater is Malkuth, and that's your earth grade. Theoricus is in Yesod. That's the air grade. Then you go to Hod and Practicus water. Philosophus goes to fire. And essentially what you don't realize you're doing at the time is a form of initiatic alchemy. You're using the terrestrial elements or the elements of the self, the psyche. And in each grade, you're sort of isolating and moving 1 to the 4. Within your attention, your focus, your life, your sphere of sensation, whatever you want to call it, and you work with that thing. And after this period of isolation and working in a specific element, these are elemental grades, you move on to the what is considered the second degree, which is in between the first and the outer and inner order, and that is when you sort of recombine yourself, the elemental self, under the auspices of spirit, the fifth element. And then that third degree of the inner order is Rosicrucian, explicitly and exclusively.
Yeah, that's a bit like Masonic ritual, isn't it? With how we talk about the points of the compass as you're going through, and then the Masonic Rosicrucian groups are necessarily after the third degree, right, within your grade. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's an interesting parallel, isn't it?
Well, that's the Golden Dawn was founded by 3 SRIA. I mean,
Hmm.
two of the founders were consecutively. One of them died and passed it on to the other one, but 2 of the founders were the supreme magus of the SRIA at the time. So it's very Rosicrucian, and it kind of borrows its structure from the Orden Golden Rosenkreuz, the German sort of Rosicrucian order that the SRIA was inspired by. So it's really a very cool chain of
Yeah.
transmission there.
Yeah. And then so SRIA, that's like the Rosicrucian group, right? Where what do they say? You have to be a Royal Archmason, right? Um, and then is that the one where like Supreme Magus I know is a title in it, right? Where each degree might take a year or so,
Yeah, I
right?
mean,
Is that the group?
so I mean, yeah, there's the SRI in the United States. It's SRICF. And I'm not a member of that. I would love to be, for anybody in North Carolina that can get me in there. Okay. But as of right now, it's kind of a closed door. Each of these things, they're called colleges rather than lodges, but the colleges,
Yeah.
they all kind of have their own state to state thing. And I've not yet gotten the shoulder tap for the SRICF in my state. Now, they were obviously an SRIA. This is I think it's I forget. I think it was like George Plummer, maybe, who made the SRIA as like this standalone Rosicrucian thing, but it had Masonic ties in England in the 1800s. And so, yeah, Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, England. And I don't know, I don't know anything about really the requirements for membership there. Actually, but I recently found out, because I've been having no luck with the SRICF here, I recently found out that if you're a Master Mason in good standing in a branch of Masonry that has concordance or is in amity with the Grand Lodge of England, which, right,
Mhm.
I should, you can actually petition and become a member of the SRIA in England. So I just found that out like last night. Now, I've not done too much investigating into that. So if I'm completely off base, or I got my information, kind of my signals twisted, that's fine. But as of, I think, last night or the night before, somebody from the SRIA in England was like, as long as you're a Master Mason in good standing and in amity, you could just join ours. So that was pretty exciting for me.
So what would be the benefit of that? I mean, you don't go to
I'd have
their
to go.
communications, right?
I'd
Yeah.
have
Okay. Well, there you go. There it is.
I'd
Yeah.
have so it would be a trip to London, but also my main thing is that I want to be. I mean, look at me. I hardly shut up. My face is plastered on the internet, and it's because a lot of my life and tenure in these organizations has been attempting to find like-minded people. And when I can find Masons that are interested and involved in this stuff, I mean, I'm overjoyed, because one of the things that I very personally and secretly wish is that I wish that, I would never want to get rid of the co-equality between male and female that exists in the Golden Dawn. It's one of the things that drew me to it. And actually, it's one of the things that made me shy away from Masonry, is that it didn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
But if completely hypothetically, if there was a recognized form of Masonry that put women through, I mean, I think everybody should be a Mason before they get into the Golden Dawn, because Masonry teaches you the things like we were talking about the ladder of virtues. Masonry gives you firm footing in those first three virtues, natural, ethical, civic, and a lot of people come to traditions like the Golden Dawn because they want to talk to spirits and things like that, so it's like there are prerequisites here that have existed since the time of Plato. You want to be a theurgist, well, you got to start here at the bottom rung. It's not A to Z. You got to go through everything first. And I think that one of the unintended consequences, just living in a postmodern age, that probably the founders of the Golden Dawn could not have ever imagined, is that we got a lot of people that don't have the basics.
Like, don't have the basics in terms of education.
No, you don't have to be educated, but there's a certain postmodernism that people come to these traditional organizations with. They seem non-traditional because they're not necessarily under the auspices of a religious institution, but they're literally vested in this kind of Edwardian traditionalism, which some of that can be pretty good. They were groundbreaking for their time, being a co-ed organization of people doing Egyptian, ceremonial ritual that's based in Masonry. But there were certain social mores. There were, certain inculcations to morality, to walking uprightly in our several stations before God and man. That a lot of people interested in the higher reaches of spirituality do not have that base level togetherness, of that foundational, just be a good human type of thing. I mean, it's there.
Mhm.
People can, with postmodernism, you can interpret anything that you want. Well, I can just, it's my own rules for what being a good person means. But I don't think that's what Masonry teaches. I don't think that's the ethos of the Platonic school. I think that these are objective, quantifiable, behavioral outcomes. And I think that you are, whether you become a Golden Dawn magician, whether you go on to the SRIA, if you're following the tenets of Blue Lodge Freemasonry, you will be a better, more spiritual person.
Yeah, no, for sure. Where, yeah, I mean, another, what do we want to say, parallel with the four virtues, right? Temperance, fortitude, justice, and then there's a fourth one,
Prudence.
prudence. There you go. I think are those. I think those are specifically called out by Plato
Yeah, in
as
the Republic.
yeah. And another thought is that the three classes of workmen, and then the three classes of society, right? The rulers. No, what is it? The Well, the rulers. I'm getting the terminology wrong, and then the warriors, and then the
Right,
workmen. Right?
right. Yeah. There's the guards.
Yeah, yeah. That I wonder if that's. And I mean that's probably. I mean it's probably like everybody classes things into threes, but you wonder if there's something going on there, right?
Yeah.
Where we have the. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, just agreeing with you. Yeah, there's this triadic structure that comes directly out of Neoplatonism. Well, Platonism too, like you're pointing out, but it's very clearly delineated in the three hypostases,
Hmm.
Plotinus, and then that kind of that pseudo Dionysian, order of nine angels, right? They have that the nine orders of angels. He has that the superior hierarchy consisting of the first three, the seraphim, cherubim, and something else. Then there's the medial hierarchy consisting of the powers and the dominations, and then there's the inferior hierarchy of angels, principalities, angels, archangels, that kind of thing. So there's that threefold structure, and then that gets taken even further in Ficino's 3 books on life that Agrippa kind of really culls a lot of his stuff from. I think Agrippa starts the 3 books of occult philosophy by saying, there is a threefold world, and the entire trajectory. I mean, he wasn't trying. I think he successfully accomplished a Renaissance reconstruction of Iamblichian theurgy. That's exactly what those books are. He even uses the Latin equivalents of the words. Synthemata in the Greek of Iamblichus becomes sigillum in Agrippa's superb Latin. So he delineates that threefold world, and the entire system of his books is based on that: the natural, celestial, and then noetic or super celestial, the mind of God. So yeah, I mean, throughout the Western esoteric traditions, it's always a threefold model.
Yeah, I've not heard of super celestial, but that makes sense. So that you have what kind of corresponds to what physical, intellectual, and then I mean, would they say super intellectual or
Spiritual.
spiritual?
That's the word he uses. That
Yeah,
is that third world it corresponds to the spiritual component in man, the pneumatic.
yeah, yeah. So you wonder, yeah, if the 3, 5, 7, the first three steps could refer to just about anything, right? Because there's just so many threes, right? And after you ascend the staircase, you get into the spiritual, which is an interesting parallel.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you wonder how many. Well, it's kind of like we were saying, like what once you're this, you have so many symbols and so much. What do we want to say? It's so much. How do I say it? But it kind of, I think you kind of create meaning where none was really intended, because we're talking about so many similar themes that you could read into things and be perfectly right in that it makes total sense and it's necessarily um, is an extension of that thought. But did the original framers intend it that way, right? Where you
Yeah.
could kind of go like hyperparallelomania, but
Well, I think one
yeah.
of the things that one of the I guess categories of knowledge, like a historian, a real true blue historian, in like that classical, almost like Dead Poets Society type of private school, just like that kind of educational institution that only existed in the 50s or so, or earlier, like,
Mhm.
and is just familiar with the classics. Uh, I think they're better poised than a metaphysician or even a magician is to interpret masonry from that angle. I mean, this is a great example right here. Jamie Paul Lamb told me to check this book out, and I'm pretty sure he got it from Chris Warnock, who I recently spoke with. The Elizabethan World Picture by E.M.W. Tilliard. This is a book by somebody. This is a book by a man who was I'm pretty sure it was like an English or a literature professor. But what he did in trying to do a history of Shakespeare was that he noticed this pattern that was occurring in Shakespeare. And not only that, but when he juxtaposed it against the society of Shakespeare at that time and the Elizabethan era, and even before the Elizabethan era, it all kind of was congruous. It was all the same. And he said it was an order. An order permeated every sector of society. It was part of the collective consciousness, was this order, and it wasn't political or social order. It was a divine hierarchical order. And so it was, you know, in the same way that we have these kind of societal or truisms that, these unspoken things that everybody kind of takes for granted, like,
Mhm.
like our science. Well, this was the science of their day. This was the popular science of that time. It was just spiritual, because they were the overwhelming majority, at least, the most vocal within society and most influential were theists. They believed in God, and a lot of them believed in the same God. So it was even more homogenized. But they had this picture of God, the world, and where human beings fit into that picture. And I think that absolutely informed. I see it. It absolutely informed. The Freemasons from the early modern period of Freemasonry. I'm talking United Grand Lodge. I'm talking about some of the Scottish stuff. Now everybody kind of agrees that Masonry existed beyond that, like earlier. How much earlier is a difference of opinion. I can't say that I have any guesses as to what Freemasonry was back then. I mean, I have my own opinions, but
Mhm.
I can't really say. But what is historically available? Because I like to include what these men were reading and what subcultures they actively participated in, the Royal Society, the Kabbalah Club, these kinds of things. Elias Ashmole writing letters to the Rosicrucian fraternity for admission, like it's these types of things tell you who a person is, and you have to factor that into the equation when you look at these early things. So, but Stuart Cleland, he kind of pointed out to me that, Masonry is something that we can project all sorts of things on, which I think is what you were alluding to. And that's absolutely true. And I happen to think that's one of the best things about Masonry. But you reach a certain point where certain symbol systems stop being applicable. When you work within the Western esoteric paradigm, Platonism, Hermetism, Rosicrucianism, it all fits. And I think that's because Masonry is the custodian of all these traditions. I'm not sure Masonry has a unique, definite point to make, but I think it is an expression of a definite and unique group of traditions, and that's Western esotericism.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. Where, yeah, you can kind of see it all coming together with uh, what's his name? Degalier. I'm probably
So yeah,
mispronouncing it.
yeah, yeah.
And Newton, they were friends. And Newton was obsessed with King Solomon's Temple. So you can see where, I mean, King Solomon's Temple probably, I mean, it has to predate, you know, early Grand Lodge Masonry, but you can kind of see where when you bring the esoteric tradition into it, you'd go nuts with it because there's so much to do with King Solomon's Temple that it's almost like if you were into like speculative alchemy, that you would almost think that that would be a better foundation, would be speculative Freemasonry, right, for the esoteric tradition, because there's the mystical tradition with Kabbalah that kind of works with it, but yeah, I mean, you can kind of see how that would work, and with Noahide Freemasonry, where you have the Enochic pillars, right, and those are eventually moved to King Solomon's temple because the Bible never describes those pillars as having anything inside of them or meaning to survive fire and flood, right? So I mean, it's hard to say it's not the what do we say? Not the embodiment of Western esotericism.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many parallels, right? I mean, the timing seems about right because you have the early grimoire period of magic obsessing over Solomon's Temple around the 14th and 15th centuries, or really, I guess the 1400s is like around about 13 and 1400s. Yeah, so 14th and 15th centuries, and that's kind of right before kind of Masonry starts to rear its head, and it's certainly just before the Rosicrucian movement as well, which happens in tandem just within 100 years, right, of each other, is the Rosicrucian manifestos and United, well, the first iterations pre Grand Lodge Masonry, but certainly very close to the Grand Lodge, and the parallel to me that just blew me away when I was learning about Platonism was the idea that, well, what is Plato's paragon? What does somebody who has achieved eudaimonia, what is your symbolic image for that, right? Because that Plato says it numerous places, speaking in
Mhm.
symbols. We're speaking in symbols because we're talking about things that transcend words. So we have to use mythic images and mythic narratives, and he does a very good job of that. And his symbol for the perfected self is a philosopher king. And what was Solomon if he was not a philosopher king?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's another huge part of it, at least to me.
Yeah. And just as a tangent on that, with the philosopher king Solomon, and then we could say the odd one out is Hiram. He's the only one that's not a king. That I mean, there's the obscure epistles of Plato, where I was talking before we went live that I wonder if Dion in the seventh epistle of Plato is the inspiration for Hiram Abiff. I've never heard that idea come out, but he's betrayed by the people that work under him, right? He was supposed to be a ruler king, which is what or a philosopher king, which is what made me think of that as you were talking. But yeah, I wonder if, because I remember that there's a lot of parallels, like he's thrown into the rubbish right after he's killed, right? He's betrayed after someone takes an oath to be loyal to him. But yeah, I wonder if there's not something there, right? And then, yeah. And then also, de Gaulier and Newton really liked Archimedes. And so I wonder, like, there's some similarities. What's that?
Love Archimedes. He built
Yeah.
built a magnifying glass
Yeah.
that made a death ray.
Or according to legend, I wonder if that's actually true.
Still, it's fine.
But, yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. But how he died, he was killed by Roman soldiers while he was saying, just no, just go away. I'm working on something, right? And they kill him. And then we kind of have the same idea. He's drawing plans. He's working on an equation while he's killed by Roman soldiers. So we kind of see parallels to Hiram, right? And then he's buried or entombed, right? And then eventually everything grows up around his tomb and it's obscured. But they have the sphere. No, is it a cylinder inside a sphere or a sphere inside a cylinder? I forget which way it is. That was his symbol, right? That's his equation that he was famous for. And then eventually, like somebody stumbles over this symbol, and they think, well, that's a weird symbol. What's going on here? And they discover his tomb, right? And then they clean up his tomb, right, to make a better monument for him. So I kind of wonder if Archimedes wasn't the inspiration to the Hiramic legend. But
well, you asked me if the Golden Dawn has its own version of the Hiramic legend, and I said no. But now that I'm hearing all this stuff, it's really spoiler alert. Okay. Mute me or earmuff me, but it's really the myth of Christian Rosenkreuz. Because actually, exactly what you're talking about is, in the Rosicrucian manifestos, he builds himself a tomb. He is interred in it, and after 120 years, they discover the tomb. They accidentally happen upon it when they go in. I mean, they see this incredible thing and all these different symbols which contain teachings, and it is replete with the knowledge of all, the universe and everything that, the spiritual keys of transcendence. At least that is kind of how it is presented in the Golden Dawn. But still in the Fama in the Fama and the Confessio, it's basically the same thing. But yeah, it all sounds like this. I don't mean to, to hop on the monomyth Campbell wagon, but it sounds, I mean,
Mhm.
there are major, I mean, not to be reductive really, but there are major commonalities here but the interesting thing is that they constantly seem to be funneled in a certain, they have this trajectory that is moving in a very specific direction in tandem with each other. They're connected by these um initiatic societies that put on these rituals, like reenacting what the manifesto said, and possibly the life of Archimedes and Dion from the Platonic letters. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing to speculate about, and it certainly draws a lot of things to one's attention to now go and investigate and contemplate and synthesize. But I don't know that we'll ever know. I mean,
Mhm.
I hope they find like an original manuscript,
Yeah.
like a draft of the third degree.
Or like a personal diary where he says, "Yeah, today I wrote the Hiramic legend and I based it off of the Four Sons of Aemon. I'm
Yeah,
proud of myself." And
exactly.
there you go. There you have it.
Until we find that explicit, you know, endorsement, then it's like it's going to be really hard, because I mean, there's a lot. We've already mentioned like 4 or 5 different possibilities.
Yeah. And yeah, they can't all be true, but they could all be wrong. So I don't know. But it makes me want to really look into it just to see. Because I mean, yeah, I mean, it'd be so nice to know where this came from. It's unfortunate it wasn't prefaced by an originating story, or maybe it's just completely from like an original story that he just came up with. You know.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it totally could be like a gigantic Rorschach test from somebody who had a really elaborate sense of humor. But I have a feeling not. But yeah, I mean, it's an incredible subject. Uh I love, Tobias Churton does a really good job in The Invisible History of the Rosicrucians, and uh the I think it's called The Golden Builders, of showing how all these things kind of connect and possible through lines. I mean, there's certainly no lull in interest behind this stuff. So hopefully we'll have a very a good few classes of Masonic scholars that come out of this, and maybe they can push carry the baton a little further.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, maybe we'll start winding down here. And if you'd want, we can address some of the comments here. There's a whole bunch.
Sure, pick a
Uh,
few that you're interested in.
let's see. Here's a good one. There we go. Let's see. Carl Karsnak. Rosicrucians are a precursor to the Scottish Rite Masons. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Freemasonry in general, not just Scottish Rite, but yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, and then especially we see it more in the Scottish Rite, but many similar concepts. Yeah, more continental than we know. Call Masons, who became very popular in the Anglosphere. Yeah, I don't think was the Scottish Rite wasn't around. I don't think.
No, I think
Um,
1850s maybe. I think it was fully formed in Charleston, South Carolina. Was the
yeah,
first what is it, Supreme Council.
yeah, I think so.
It was a collection of, it came, I think there were 25 degrees that it inherited from French Masonry, that they called high degree Masonry at the time. a whole collection of degrees, basically imported. But then really, Pike kind of does his own thing over it. But yeah, there's, what is it, the 18th degree? There's that whole Rosicrucian component even still in the Scottish Rite. Scottish Rite's definitely, if you want to learn about the connections, or at least be immersed in the symbolism of the Western esoteric traditions while you're in Masonry, I think that's probably the place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, yeah, I mean, you're Scottish, right? I'd presume, right?
Not all the way, but
All right. Yeah, you're just. Are you like you're in the middle of the
yeah,
degree?
I've done I've done more research than anything else on it. But definitely looking soon to cap it all off. I mean, I remember when I was 24, I bought. There used to be a Barnes and Noble on Astor Place in New York City, and I went in there, and this is obviously when Barnes and Noble had decent stuff, and it wasn't all witch talk bullshit. But it's
Mhm.
I got Morals and Dogma, and I was like, it's big, man, but I'm gonna read it, and I actually plowed through most of it. So granted, there's no formal rituals in there, but it
Mhm.
was definitely a heady education or commentary on Pike's precious, degree system.
Yeah, yeah. I know it's pretty dense. Rules and Dogma. So is there something to the idea of Cain having initiated Abel into the mysteries of Freemasonry? I've not heard that idea before.
So there's obviously several connections with Cain and Freemasonry. Uh, typically from um one of his ancestors who was considered uh, in the Bible is referred to as the first metallurgist, the first metal worker. Um, and that's significant, particularly having to do with this idea of Hellenistic alchemy. By way of, let's say, Zosimus of Panopolis, who really, I mean, even there, right, in his visions that he writes about, he goes into, he sleeps and he has these sort of spiritual dreams about the processes of alchemy as applied to the self and the soul. And there are many, many correlations to Masonry, like, a staircase of 15 stairs that leads to an altar. There's different penalties and punishments corresponding to having the throat cut and being beheaded and stuff like that, that are meant to portray. These penalties are basically, I would say, transmutations or periods of transmutation for the substance that is being worked on. And what he was ultimately familiar with, which was he was a scribe priest in Hellenistic Egypt, for metallurgy, right? The priest class was kind of always uh, stratified. They're priest scribes, priest doctors, priest astronomers. It was like they were the learned people. They knew, how to read and write and communicate and investigate nature, because nature was their gods, right? So their devotion to a particular god was the investigation of that aspect of nature over which their god had control or sovereignty. So you see Zosimus talking a lot about the alchemical processes being something that he calls kairokmeta, handcraft. And so he again is this craftsman, and you see that echoed in one of Cain's ancestors. Now, On the other hand, you've got somebody like Pasquale who talks a lot about rather than offerings that Cain and Abel give to God, he talks about religious ceremonies, rituals that they render unto creative deity, and obviously deity, God prefers Abel's ritual. So that's as much as I understand in that capacity. I don't personally see anything alluding to Cain initiating Abel. There's something really cool there. I will agree with you, Elliot. It's the first time I've kind of conceptualized it in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder where that idea comes from. I know there's, yeah, yeah. And then one thing, returning back to what you had mentioned about within the esoteric traditions, there's 5 = 6 for one of the grades.
Yeah.
Now, I've noticed that that's like a recurring thing. Like, I think in one esoteric tradition, there's like 0 = 0.
That's the Golden Dawn as well. That's the
Yeah.
neophyte.
And what does that mean? Like, okay, 0 = 0. Okay, fact checkers have determined that's true, but 5 = 6. That we've determined that to be misleading and factually inaccurate. Like, why does it say 5 = 6?
It says 5 = 6 because of the grade structure on the tree of life. So when you become a neophyte in the Golden Dawn, you're a probationer, really. I mean, you've undergone a ritual now that seals you into this spiritual tradition for lifetimes, for better or for worse. But even if you don't continue, but it's still technically considered a probationary grade. You don't have to move on to the next one. So 0 = 0 is nowhere on that tree. You're not on the tree of life yet. 1 = 10, you're in Malkuth. That's your first step onto the tree, and it's the 10th Sephiroth, or the 10th Sephirah. 2 = 9, your second step, the 9th Sephirah. 3 = 8, your third step, the 8th Sephirah. 4 = 7, etc., etc. Then you get here, and 5 = 6, your fifth movement on the tree of life is to the 6th Sephirah of Tefereth.
Got it.
Yeah.
And why do they express it in terms of like 4 = 7 and whatnot? Is there like special reasoning for that, or is it that's just how it's done?
Well, some of it has to do with this juxtaposition of there's a diagram in the Golden Dawn called the sword and the serpent, or the lightning flash and the serpent of wisdom. And it has to do with the downward motion of essentially I would say, what am I trying? I had it on the tip of my tongue and it left. The word I'm looking for, I would say the like gravitational momentum of every instant of creation that serves as a flaming sword to keep us without the Garden of Eden. And then the ascent upward is taking the form of that kind of serpentine, winding, slower, undulating path against that downward momentum. It has to do with that. And all because each one of them each of those in the Golden Dawn tradition, each one of those letters is juxtaposed. One's in a circle, the other's in a square. And if we know anything about the Western esoteric traditions, that is the ultimate equation for the spiritualization of materiality, squaring the circle, right? Which is geometrically an intractable problem. It cannot be solved. But on the other hand, there's a spiritual analogy there. the square is the symbol of materiality, having, this kind of, there's four angles. I mean, if you look around the room that you're in, whatever you're in, most things take the form of some sort of square or rectangle, having four angles. It's a bookcase, it's the top of my desk, it's a computer screen, it's this book I got here, it's my chair, the four legs on my chair, the windows. That's just a property of materiality, is that quaternary, there's the four elements. Whereas a circle has no beginning and no end. It has no angles. And so it represents eternity, and spirituality. And the bringing of those two things together is the embodying of the archetype. It's the human becoming the vessel of the divine part of themselves. And we see that exemplified in the lodge, right? What does a square make? What do the compasses make? And why are they together? Why are they on top? Why are they conjoined?
Mm-hmm.
So, and in the middle of the lodge. So it's that's a huge proposition in our equation here of the spiritual science. So that grade structure, I like to digress, but the grade structure ultimately is inherited from something called the Orden Golden Rosenkreuz, which is an alchemical Rosicrucian order in Germany. And I believe the 1700s started by a man named, or pioneered at least by a man named Hermann Fichtold. I've heard that Adam McLean, the translator, is he's just pumping out these obscure alchemical texts. I hear he's working on one of Hermann Fichtold's works right now, which would be huge if we got this thing translated this year, which it may already be out. I'm not even sure. But so that whole grade structure and that numeration is inherited from that society. Much of what they did is still either clandestine, or I'm not clandestine, but it's just undiscovered, or it remains untranslated. So there are really clues as to who has the best guess as to what the I guess original scheme was behind that numeration.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, Crowley, I think, loved that too, didn't he? That kind of equation deal.
His first order was the Golden Dawn. So he basically he got put through the outer order in a year, and then which is insane by any metric. And then the adepts of his temple did not recommend him for advancement to the inner order because of his character or lack thereof. It did not exemplify what they considered to be Rosicrucian ideals. He didn't live it. But he was put through anyway because he was kind of acting as a lackey for the head guy at the time. And what happened was this protracted period of dissolution and schism. And he ended up being on the wrong side of the fence, I think, in that thing. And he gradually became very disillusioned with the leadership and with the order as a whole. There are journal entries of him reminding himself to find somebody to actually take care of Sam Mathers and get rid of him. But he did co-opt the Golden Dawn system and then invert it. So a lot of people will find, they'll find the AA or Thelema or even Crowley's version of the OTO, right? Because Crowley didn't inherit the OTO. Theodore Roos kicked him out. And then I think the next week he declared himself the head of the order. And he basically, he had a habit of doing that. He would get kicked out or he would leave. There'd be bad blood. And he'd say, well, I'm the head and I'm doing it my way now. And he kind of did that with the Golden Dawn system, with the AA and then using certain of those bodies to promulgate or proliferate his religion of Thelema. But it was universally antithetical to the system and the teachings of the Golden Dawn, which is why even now in the modern day, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, you can't join the order if you currently belong to any Crowley orders, because they don't work together, So yeah, he borrowed a lot from the Golden Dawn, but he also he did his own thing with it. He completely corrupted it.
Yeah, he was a bit of a egomaniac, and they didn't think he was the most moral person. Is that the gist of it?
So Florence Farr, the actress, who was not considered prudish in her time, right?
Mm-hmm.
She was I would say a rebel in her day. She basically chided him for his sexual proclivities. His he was just did not have the self-control that was becoming of an adept of a Rosicrucian order. But there were a lot of other things. Yeah, there were a lot of other things. I mean, everybody that kind of met Crowley or interacted with him at one time or another got burnt. There's a really great fair treatment. I'm not trying to say he had no redeeming qualities. I mean, book 4, and I think this has more to do with the fact that it was dictated to somebody who sort of organized his thoughts. Book 4 is one of the most lucid and significant works on occultism that I could recommend anybody. But so I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but on the whole, you're not going. People think, oh, Crowley was in the Golden Dawn first, so I know what Thelema is, I know what the AA is. Let me go to the Golden Dawn, and then they get here and they're like, what the hell is this? Because it's like, yeah, I mean, what were you thinking? If there's a really great book called The Eye in the Triangle that Israel Regardie wrote about his relationship with Crowley, and because he was his secretary for a number of years. And one of the things is that when Crowley got pissed off at Regardie, he wrote to like one of Regardie's employers telling him that he had like a horrible, like he was a chronic masturbator to demerit his character. And it's like, you look at Crowley and then what he tried to do, right? In the Golden Dawn, you have, the formula of the dying and resurrecting god, Osiris, right? There's Isis, Osiris, and Typhon. And that's the formula of the adept, or at least the 5-6. The Adeptus Minor. Crowley said, to death with the old gods. I'm going to usher in a new eon, the eon of Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris. And he called him the crowned and conquering child. And I can think of no better epithet for Crowley himself. It's just temper tantrums. He was a big child. You see that in his writings, you see it in his journals, you see it in his behavior, and you see it in his treatment of, he dragged, first of all, if you look at the Equinox, he caricatured these people viciously. He made every one of his Golden Dawn contemporaries completely absurd, except for himself. And then he dragged Mathers into this protracted court battle for years. This doesn't seem like a Rosicrucian, so it's a really interesting, and I guess it kind of sticks in my craw about how often I'll come to occult circles to have a serious discussion and be met by people who want to talk about Crowley as if he's someone serious, and it's just not the case.
Got it. Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with Crowley.
Good.
Oh, here, maybe we'll hit up this one. Philosophical Minds podcast.
Hey, Scott.
Yeah, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. I'll check it out. What are your thoughts on Adam Weishaupt and the rituals or degrees of the Bavarian Illuminati? I didn't know that there were rituals associated with the Illuminati.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, are you familiar with them and what they involve? I'd
Uh,
imagine.
well, I haven't seen all of them, but I would say they're based on a Masonic template, but they're completely secular. Um, and formalities. I don't think so. Let's clear the air. The Bavarian Illuminati never was Masonic, ever. It was its own thing. Um, because at the time it violated probably several of the Masonic landmarks. Uh, but it was just never a part of you know regular masonry. But as far as the rituals go, I don't think they thought they were doing the same thing Masons think they're doing when they put on a ritual. I think the intention behind them is different. I think that it was at a time when ritualistic or ritualized meetings for organizations was very in vogue. It was very posh.
Mhm.
And I also think that it brought men together in a almost martial bond that maybe wasn't there anymore, right? It allowed them to like continue this more hierarchical militaristic tradition without actually having to be at war, and to be able to bond and interact with each other, and under the auspices of a framework as such. But I think ultimately, I mean, it's a secular organization, and they wanted to secularize the world. They were kind of like the inverse of the Rosicrucians, you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I mean, Rosicrucians aren't really trying to religify the world, but maybe view the world religiously, I guess.
While it's not stated in the original manifestos, there are appendants to the manifestos that are normally kind of these lists and commentaries that are appended to them. But I would say that the one of those things in the commentaries was specifically a universal reformation of mankind. Now, it was along, I mean, they were theists, absolutely, because
Mhm.
they constantly, from the horse's mouth, admonished piety and prayer. That was a huge thing and even in the original Rosicrucian documents. But their reformation was along the lines of getting right with God, but also um, a Paracelsian alchemical paradigm of uh, an age of universal wisdom, eternal day, so to speak. It's like kind of what I guess we tried to accomplish in the institutionalized or universal education system, but failed horrendously with. But they wanted everyone to kind of become imbued with these enlightenment ideals of being educated and becoming adroit in philosophy and those kinds of things, but really along these Paracelsian alchemical sort of in that kind of paradigm. So it was this kind of thing where it was like, knowledge is only possible because of the divine, right? It's the same way Plato allegorizes the sun in the allegory of the cave,
Mhm.
not only as that which is known, but knowledge itself. That's what he tries to communicate. He says that when talking about, allegorizing the sun as to agathon. It's not just, light, it's light itself. It's not just the things you're seeing because light is falling on it. It's the light itself, it's knowledge itself. And so I think that it's there persisted up until, a relatively late period, this idea that was, to become more educated is to become more cognizant or familiarized to the divine. I think they approached it that way. Then you have the Bavarian Illuminati, who they removed God from that equation, and it was just like, what can you possibly worship at that point if not, nature and the natural tendencies within the self, which are what we were talking about earlier, the more clephotic inclinations. They don't have to appear as these bestial caveman. If anything, it's that, worldly man that has these very fine, refined tastes. Still just as much a slave to carnal or material impulses. And I think that's, kind of where we're at now anyway.
Yeah. Well, and you wonder if they're not really that far apart, where you're looking at like the allegory of the cave. You have, what do we want to say, the good, right, from what everything comes, knowledge itself. And then you're looking at just the worldly. You could kind of see that as like imitative of something, but maybe from that point of view, you're not really thinking of it in terms of like there's an ideal material, or I don't know, but yet I don't know. It just seems that maybe those two ways of looking at it aren't really all that far apart. Where
No, I mean, there's just a fundamental difference in direction. So it's the same way, like, you know, um, in the Platonic times, the whole idea was moving outward and away from the terrestrial in order to ascend, which brought us closer to God, the divine. Now, in the Platinian cosmology, which I really love, I truly love his. It's a lifetime's work to read the Aeneads and understand them. But there are certain fundamentals. There are these core ideas in Platinian theology, cosmology, ontology, that are super, super foundational to everything that happens afterwards. And I think, to be honest with you, a lot of it is he didn't just expand it. I think he really actually clarified a lot of what Plato was talking about. He did innovate to a certain degree, but I think also he clarified. And and it's what we were talking about before, he says highly matter is not evil in and of itself. But when the soul pursues highly towards its own ends, it becomes as an evil. And so that's the fundamental difference, right? To acquire knowledge, to ascend the world, is not worldliness. Worldliness, I think, that they talked about would be to acquire experience, to become mired in the world. And because Plotinus basically points out that the soul, the nous, and the soul, the psyche, as it descends towards matter, it doesn't realize that it's antithetical to matter. It's of two different natures. And so he says, if the soul turns back quickly, then no harm will be done to it. But it's when the soul stays highly in matter and pursues it towards its own ends that the soul becomes tainted, can actually become stuck in it like clay or tar. It becomes sticky, and it weighs the soul down. And basically what he's talking about, again, is revisiting that the myth of Persephone and Hades. You taste the fruit of the underworld, you will have to come back. You will not be freed from the karmic cycle, which their word for it, the Platonic word for that, was anagke, the spindle of necessity. Anagke does not mean necessity, it means bondage.
Interesting. And is that the same for? Yeah. So when we say like in Timaeus, how they say that, what is there? There's necessity and will, or is that the two pairings? That there's bondage. It means bondage rather than necessity.
Anagke, really, the translation of anagke means like constraint, means I'm bound. Now that can mean either, like, because what happens is when you look at where that comes from, or at least within this karmic context, right?
Mhm.
Plato's talking about in the book, in the 10th book of the Republic, the myth of he's talking about specifically when a soul is bound, literally tied to its daimon, and then the pair are now indissolubly tied to the spindle of a Nagke, that massive column that runs through the universe and beyond. And it's at that point where one of the Moirai cuts the string, and it's done. The fate is sealed. And so I think of it in that, it's a very, very karmic tale. I mean, it's basically saying, like, okay, you're choosing your life, because you choose your diamond and you choose your life, and then you choose to be bound to this as a gigantic spindle. You're literally wrapped. And then there are 3 Moirai: Clotho, Lachesis, and then there's one more. I forget the name, but Atropos. Okay, yeah. So Atropos is the third one, and she's the one who cuts the string. Clotho spins the yarn. Lachesis measures it, and Atropos cuts it. And Atropos means like inevitable. Like, so that can mean either, okay, we've measured the length of your life and we're cutting it. There are these definite terms, the length of life and the beginning and the end, fate and destiny. But then there's also that component where it's a symbol of, it's inevitable now. You are bound to this machine. There's no turning back. So yeah, anake means really constraint. Doesn't mean necessity. That's the thing. It's like it's like people, the translators they select the words that they want to use, that they think.
Mhm.
But the issue is like, are you being, if you're not connected to the core of the message, you can't be true to it, because you're interpolating by choosing a word that has like your shade of your preferred shade, your
Mhm.
preferred color of meaning. But really the word means like bondage, constraint, being like tied to something.
Yeah, which, I mean, I guess they're related. It's necessarily the case that, right? Like, there's just no way out of it that it's the case. It's necessity.
Yeah.
And then same thing with forms, because forms are actually formless. So it doesn't make sense to call them forms, really. We could call them conceptions. Maybe it would be a better.
Well, and that's the word he uses is idoi, right? Which is kind of where we get the word idea.
Idea. That's a better one, isn't it?
Yeah. We translate them into ideals, but really the word is I'm pretty sure it's a cognate of the English idea, idoi.
Yeah.
You know.
Which, I mean, makes sense. Like with words, I think this was before we went live, but like you can put the idea of an apple in somebody's head, right?
Yeah.
And that's probably where no pun intended, the idea of this ideal form comes from, is like, yeah, you can just instantly like transport it into someone's brain. And so there must be something there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's one of the most incredible things. That's another, it's kind of, again, we were talking earlier about how we take words and that power for granted. The words only have that power because of the imaginal faculty, the human mind's ability to see things without seeing them. And with it's like supra sensory, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm not using my eyes, but the same part of my mind, brain, however you conceive it, that processes the information that is an apple is able to do that without the information. It's like without the actual physical sensorial input.
Mhm.
And so that imaginal faculty is really the thing, personally, I feel, that separates us. I think it's what one of the psychic, and I don't mean psychic in new agey, I mean like in psyche. It's one of those components of the psyche that convinced the ancients that something in here is divine. I'm not that animal on the floor licking its ass. Like I am. There is a higher level of cognition, and the Plotinus especially, he makes this reference to, like, we've received a portion of the nous. We also have the divine nous in us. It's an attenuated version of that, but that's the only reason, to Plotinus, that theoria can work. The only reason I can achieve henosis through divine contemplation, theoria, is because I'm still linked. My nous is still conversant with the divine nous. It's highly that becomes an obstruction, because I keep looking down at the material instead of looking up at my connection to the divine.
Yeah, which, I mean, goes back to the intelligible versus sensible, right? Where you wonder how that works when, like, like talking to somebody, that's necessarily sensible, but like the intelligible, just using your intellect, it's almost like, how do you communicate to others with just the intellect? I don't know if you can, because you have to you have to have the senses, right? But like with uh, deity or the good, it's almost like you're discovering what's out there, right? If you're discovering mathematics, right? And just the really how what exists in mathematics, what there is to discover, right? Same thing with the rest of the sciences. That it's almost like you're picking up what the good is emanating, right? So in that respect, it is communication, but really, I don't know if it's more like a one-way communication. So it's not really like a discussion.
Well, that's the key behind the whole question behind spirituality and the idea of consciousness, right? Because, right, so we have a very convoluted idea of what consciousness is, because we are witnesses, we're testaments to what consciousness can be when it is sophisticated to the point of self-awareness. But personally, when I hear of the ancient talking about the universe being permeated with divine nous, I don't just regard that as the logistikon, the logos, the order, the rationale behind the universe. I also see it as like everything is constantly in communication, even at the atomic level, right? Atoma being a Greek term, unbreakable, right? I mean, that idea comes from Greek philosophy. So you can't even tell me they weren't aware of atoms. They might not have seen them under a microscope, but they fucking they presaged them, they predicted them with no microscopes. So that's the power of the mind, right? But but this idea, even at the molecular level of attraction and repulsion, well, that's predicated on some sort of mutual recognition, which is a form of communication. If there were no underlying laws to the universe, no molecule would have any reason to be repelled by another. But there is order, there is nous, there is a recognition, even of a particle in some sort of, you could try and explain it away. Oh, it's a electromagnetic field. Where does any of that shit come from? Where it just appear out of nowhere, out of nothing. That's just, I mean, I wrote something recently that's like, it's just as much a leap of faith to read Dawkins as it is to read doll, right? So it's you can't tell me that these things just spontaneously came out of nowhere. That's taking a leap of faith, which is typically what empiricists and reductionists and positivists criticize religious people for doing. This is a leap of faith, to say that, it's just there. It's because science is predicated on the idea, give me one free miracle and I'll explain the rest. But it's a form of mutual recognition, forces that have actions and reactions. And that to me is a form of consciousness. It's not as sophisticated. I mean, you even look at heliotropism. A plant will turn to face the sun. There's some kind of exchange there. It doesn't have to be, frontal lobe, cerebral cortex evolved. It doesn't have to be me writing you a letter or giving you a verbal command. Everything is in constant communication with each other. And that is, to me, the nous at work, diffuse, permeated through everything.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah. I mean, it's that's probably where the idea of emanation kind of came from. I think, like, increasingly, I mean, it just seems apparent, right? With, the material, intellectual.
Yeah, and a lot of people aren't fans of it because they can't explain it.
Yeah, which, I mean, they're not wrong. It's hard to give like an ultimate explanation on it, right? Like, I don't know if we can.
You can't. That's why we use symbols. We use symbols. That was one of the main tenets of the Platonic dialogues, is just keep returning to the fact that, like, look, we can only go so far to describe the ineffable, to describe the indescribable, because it transcends words, it pre-exists words. It's all these things are pre-verbal. It's like trying to, like, if I told you to, like, imagine in your head a color that you've never seen before, you can't do it.
Yeah, which it's like the idea of, I forget the term, but like negation to everything, not this, not that. All it is it is, right? So it's hard to conceptualize like actual nothing next to nothingness, right? When Timaeus, I keep going back to that, but like all, like, just taking away aspects until all it is that it is, right?
Yeah.
Which I wonder if that's not where we got the idea from Genesis, right? I am, right? Where
I am that I am. Yeah.
yeah, that's where, I mean, it's from Timaeus, right? But
well, it's interesting. So that's technically like what we would call apophasis, speaking in negation. Again,
I think that's the term. Yeah.
Yeah. So Plotinus was big on that. But we see it throughout. We even see it in the East around the same time of, if you want to talk about Platonic Orientalism. But really, and you see it imported into Kabbalah with the three veils of negative existence. Ein Sof, Ein Sof Ur. Limitless, unbreakable light. It's there. Limitless is, or really, it's like not, then like no limit, and then limitless light. That's really a more literal translation of that. So it's that right there is an importation of the apophatic tradition. But the important thing, right, when we meet a wall like this, is to understand, like, it's just a wall, and we can go beyond it, but we can't go in the vehicle we use to get to the wall. That's the whole point of E.M. Leakey theurgy, all of it. And he goes to great pains, in probably, tens of thousands of words which had to have been handwritten at the time, to describe how and why you resort to theurgy, because Iamblichus automatically says, it's called On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians, right? Because that's who he's talking about. He's trying to relocate the locus of Henosis within an ancient, or for his time period, pre-modern tradition. The ancient Egyptians did it this way. The ancient Chaldeans did it. The ancient Assyrians did it this way. These were their religious expressions or applications of philosophy, because you cannot experience the divine intellectually. This is kind of where, and you get into these weird grounds. This is where him and Plotinus kind of don't agree, but still kind of do. Because Plotinus conceptualized Theoria also as like a supra-rational state, but Iamblichus said that we need ritual and intercession of these spiritual intermediaries to assist us in achieving those states and in sort of assimilating new aspects to the self, deifying us really to some degree. He says in one part of De Mysteriis, he says, at a certain point you can take your diamond, you meet your diamond, and it'll take you to a god, and maybe you'll become a god. He's talking about, the fact that the human can be sort of leveled up in a lot of ways. But his main point of contention was, it was sort of a response to what he perceived as Greek hyper-rationalism that was very characteristic of the Platonic school. And theurgy was a way to go beyond the rational in a way that was controlled. If they were administering psychotropics and hallucinogens at at Eleusis and the other mystery rites, it was not like a prolonged, okay, you're like this for a week thing. It's like this little taste of what was behind the veil, a gnosis, an experience of that side. Now, theurgy attempted to reach that at will, and it was the same thing really in Theoria, but I think Theoria was more ascetic, whereas theurgy embraced the material because it saw the material as permeated with the divine. So I take that as, that's before I involved all this hyper rationalism in feeling like I felt compelled to be able to speak and articulate these things to people and draw and kind of bring these threads together in a way that is cognizable. Really, I mean, I was way more versed in the supra-rational forms of really Gnostic experiences. So I know that they're possible. And I know that the Western mystery traditions, particularly in things like the Golden Dawn, they're trying to take you there. But it's just the key is to just not get too attached to the rational discursive mind in all this.
Yeah. Which you wonder if Masonry is more, what do we want to say, just knowledge based, where it's not trying to create like a gnosis experience. Would you say that or if it's more of just like a basic overview of the esoteric tradition?
I see attaining the top of getting to the top of the spiral staircase and entering into the middle chamber. To me, that's your Gnostic experience. You have now, what do I want to say, supervened. You've gone beyond the knowledge of the terrestrial world. There's nothing else for you to know. And there, right, what do you do when you get to the middle chamber? Well, in the North Carolina district, you await further instruction. And then what has to take place in the following degree is this kind of, anachronistic myth that you undergo that's not tied to anything really. Well, it's tied to something scriptural by way of the Temple of Solomon, but it's a significant departure from anything that's, canonically there. But I think that is ultimately what the third degree is also trying to say, is right, because what is associated with that rational discursive, that people hold on to it because they're afraid, and that fear in and of itself will prevent you from having any kind of experience. And there's so many prepackaged, in that Hegelian dialectic, so many prepackaged ideologies to convince you that this stuff isn't possible and that it's all some sort of psychological machination. And so, yeah, that it's like these kind of limiters, these limitations are installed in us. It was not so for ancient peoples. They didn't have this bullshit, clouding their ability to go beyond their, these installed expectations, and which it's not impossible for modern people to do. It's like you can only appeal so much to experience, but the main goal here is to have people go and truly sincerely attempt it themselves. I think that's ultimately what Freemasonry wants to have happen. I think that's certainly what the Golden Dawn and Martinism are trying to have happen. But there are definitely ways to get there. There are roads up the holy mountain, so to speak. Maybe at a certain point all of them converge, but this is the Western esoteric tradition. This is the Western expression of that started in that little seedbed of Hellenism, of Alexandria, during the Hellenistic Egypt, that whole period, and branched out into the beautiful tradition that we've inherited, and we are rediscovering it at the present time. But I think really, that it's tough to talk about the third degree and make the points as salient as I want them to be, because I'm obligated not to talk about it, or at least key features. But ultimately, I think that the main symbolic thing that is happening in the third degree is that your intellectual self is very, very closely allied to your internal monologue and all the associations of your persona. And that has to die for the spirit, for the soul to live, But the thing is, we use it. It's not some sort of like, I'm not, you're familiar with Diogenes the Cynic, he
No.
so Diogenes the Cynic, kynikos in classical Greek meant dog. And they called him Diogenes the dog because he lived in a barrel under a staircase on the streets of Athens. And he kind of, he'd go around in the daytime with a lit lamp saying, "I'm looking for an honest man." And very famous story of Alexander the Great came to Athens, and Diogenes was laying there sunbathing, and Alexander stood and he said, "Get out of my sun, get out. You're standing in my sunlight." So Diogenes is kind of an extreme ascetic example of the abandonment of all those things. And I love Plato's quote, "Diogenes is Socrates gone mad." And I think that's really, really apropos. So I think that, the same thing with Iamblichian theurgy. We're utilizing everything that the staircase has to offer, because each one takes us closer, brings us higher, gets us to that middle chamber, in which we have to receive that further instruction, which ultimately culminates in some form of self-sacrifice in order to have the Gnostic experience. I think the Gnostic experience, somebody recently said to me, "I had a Gnostic experience and I couldn't assimilate all the information. And I'm trying to figure out all the answers I got." And I said, "Well, look at like the Corpus Hermeticum, them talking about nous. Look at the discourse on the 8th and the 9th. They're talking about, connecting with the divine nous." None of those experiences were intellectually assimilated. It was completely antithetical to the nature of the experience. It would come to a point where like the theurgist or the priest or the teacher, whoever, the pedagogue would connect with the divine mind and then start shouting to the student, like, I don't understand what I see. There are no words to explain this, because the purpose, the telos, or the function of the experience is not intellectual, it's transformative.
Yeah. Yeah. And ineffable, isn't it? Yeah. All right. So here, maybe, let's see. We'll see if we can wrap up here. Yeah. And then any final thoughts that you want to conclude with?
Uh, well, it's always very pleasant speaking with you. I think this was a really great. This is a really great. I think because you and I established a rapport in like the preceding episode that we did, I felt really, really comfortable, and you definitely facilitated a wonderful discussion. So I thank you for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. Very, interesting. You're very, really knowledgeable about, the esoteric and Freemasonry. So it's, yeah, I always learn a lot. And yeah, I mean, it's few people that are knowledgeable on Plato and Freemasonry, which is, yeah, good deal. All right. Well, yeah, thanks so much for coming. And everybody check out Arcanum, and that's a V instead of a U for Arcanum.
Yeah, you can
Mhm.
get basically everything, my latest streaming video, all the podcasts, the blog, any of these kind of interviews that I've done with people on ikebaker.com, ikebaker.com.
All right. Yeah, brilliant. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.